Okay, everyone, we might make a start. So thank you so much again for joining us today. We're here with Penny from Community Legal Centres Queensland, who will be presenting. And she'll be talking to us about governance in community legal centres. So just to commence, I'll make sure that everyone can hear what we're saying. If you can use the GoToWebinar control panel and just press the button that looks like a hand to show that you can hear us. And we'll see the hands come up at our end and we'll know that everything is working okay. So I can see some hands are coming up, which is fantastic. Okay, that's great. Thanks, everyone. I'll just pop your hands down. There's already a question through. Nope, that's okay. All right, so thanks again for joining us. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding this webinar today. So in Brisbane, they're the Turrbal and the Yagara people. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play in our society. As this webinar is being viewed by people throughout Queensland and possibly Australia, I'd like to also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land throughout the country and welcome any First Australians here with us today to the session. So as I mentioned, today we've got Penny Sullivan, who's the Regional Accreditation Coordinator at Community Legal Centres Queensland. Many of you hopefully will have met Penny before at conferences, or perhaps she came to visit your centre through the accreditation process. So Penny's got a wealth of information and hands-on experience when it comes to community legal centres and management committees, particularly in the context of the National Accreditation Scheme. She'll talk to us about the management committee's role as a leadership team, how they set the strategic direction for the community legal centres operation, and work with staff and management as a governance body and employer. Governance, as you know, is a very big and important field, so there is a lot of ground to cover today, and we may go a little bit over the allocated hour. If you need to leave at 11:30 when we're due to finish, please feel free. We will be recording today's webinar, so you can always watch the end at a later time. If you have any questions and can't stay until the end, please feel free to email them through to me and I'll pass them on to Penny and she can send you her fantastic response over. So we will leave the questions to the end. There are two ways you can ask questions. You can press the button that looks like a hand and we'll see your hands go up at our end and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question via a microphone. Or the easier way is to just type your question into the question box and we'll see those come through and read them out for you. So if there are any technical issues or any, sort of non-governance related stuff that you need to get in touch with me about, if you can just email them through to me, hopefully you'll have that email. It's sdo@communitylegalqld.org.au, just because we're sharing a screen today, so I can't see them come up live. That would be fantastic. I think everything else is covered. I have sent out the PowerPoints to everyone who registered yesterday afternoon, but I know there's a couple of newcomers who've registered this morning. So you can actually download those from the GoToWebinar control panel just under the handouts tab. And I think without further ado, I might be able to hand over to Penny now. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope you enjoy.
Thanks so much, Carly, for that lovely introduction and scene setting for the webinar today. So just by way of introduction of myself, I'm the Regional Accreditation Coordinator for Queensland, and my key responsibilities are really to work with CLCs in Queensland under the National Accreditation Scheme. So I'm undertaking reviews under that scheme to assess how well centres are meeting the standards and assist centres to identify areas for continuous improvement. So the role that I take is really focusing on systems and processes. And we really encourage centres to think about ensuring that crucial information isn't just held in an individual's head, but is documented and shared so it can exist beyond the current workforce. So that's just quickly by way of introduction. I'm just going to make sure that I have myself in order here and can get through the slides in the appropriate way. Just a little overview of what we're here to do today. So our intention is to give a bit of an introduction and a refresher on some essential concepts and general principles of governance. We're going to have a look at the National Accreditation Scheme and cover some specific areas of governance under that scheme in a little more detail. Our intention really is to use this session to establish a baseline and really begin a conversation around governance. And in the future, we're going to build on that base through some deeper dives into particular elements of governance as part of our ongoing webinar program. We're including sessions on governance in our conference and leadership workshop sessions. And of course, we'll be doing some information and resource sharing. So in terms of this webinar itself, a quick overview, we're going to touch on some general principles of governance, so a definition and what some of the benefits of good governance are. Then we're going to take a bit of a closer look at the National Accreditation Scheme, so look at what the applicable standards are that relate to governance. We're going to have a little bit of a look at some data that's come out of some analysis of improvement plans that we've been able to do so far, and that gives us a bit of a sense of what the main governance gaps are for CLCs at the moment in relation to governance. And then we're going to take a little bit of a look at governance in practice. So responsibilities, who does what, how all of that fits together, what directors' duties and liabilities are and how they apply, and then have a look at some actual tools for good governance. So we will move through reasonably quickly, I hope. If, as Carly said, if you have questions, I'm happy to take them at the end or send them to me out of session. So what we're going to do now is a quick poll, which Carly is going to drive for me, which just gives us a bit of a sense of where our participants are from today, so what sort of role you have, and that gives me a bit of a sense of the audience that we're dealing with. So we'll just get that poll happening and I will sit tight while that occurs. Okay, so that's given me a really good sense of where the bulk of our audience is coming from today, and it's pretty evident that we've got a lot of people with us who are either on the management committee of a CLC or are a manager of a CLC, and we have some people who are joining us from other organisations and some people who just have a general interest in governance. So that's terrific. Hopefully the session today will provide a little bit of something for everyone. I am mindful that we are taking a first principles approach. So hopefully that will provide a refresher for those of you who are very experienced and a good introduction for those of you who may be a little bit earlier in your governance career. So moving on to some general principles of governance, I suppose we should start at the outset by looking at what is governance actually and a definition. There's lots of formulations of what governance is, but in essence it refers to the processes, activities and relationships that make sure an organisation is effectively and properly run. So in simple terms, we could say governance is the what and the where. So the what the organisation does and where it wants to go. And management is the how and the who. So how will the organisation get there and who will do it? We can see that effective organisational governance really is about ensuring transparency and accountability, independence and performance. And it relies on practices and procedures that assist an organisation to do its work effectively and openly, and where roles and responsibilities are clearly understood. So it ensures that the organisation is transparent in its decision making, accountable for its performance and use of funds, able to exercise independent judgment and make decisions about the best interests of whom it serves, and delivers on its purpose and agreed outcomes. So it does rely on strong relationships between members of the governing body and stakeholders, and so it's really about collective rather than individual responsibilities, and we'll touch on that in more detail a little bit further on. So governance obviously doesn't just exist in a vacuum. We don't just do governance for the sake of tying everyone up in red tape. We're really looking to see what benefits good governance will deliver for an organisation. And I've made a list there that you can run through, and I'll talk to that in a little more detail. So effective planning and positioning of your organisation. So this is really about meeting client and stakeholder needs into the future, giving confidence that you can respond to emerging trends or changing community expectations, making sure your organisation is best placed to respond to current and emerging challenges. Ensuring risks are properly identified, assessed and managed. So identification, assessment, management and treatment of risks is a core governance responsibility. It's really about protecting your organisation from day-to-day or operational risk, as well as strategic or big picture risk. So a good governance framework is going to get you on the front foot to mitigate or reduce risks over time. It's essential to meet the legislative, regulatory and contractual obligations upon your CLC or indeed any organisation. So that would include obligations for reporting, so for instance the ATO or fair trading, as well as funding agreements, employment of staff, any of those legal or contractual obligations that your centre or your organisation is subjected to. Managing and monitoring performance is about delivering on the organisational purpose. So achieving what your organisation is there to do and being accountable to your funders and stakeholders. Another benefit is that it's going to allow your centre to maximise the impact of its available and other resources. So making sure resources are used wisely and well, that they're directed to the true purposes of the organisation, and it will also help to protect from financial risks and improper expenditure. So it's really about focusing on the right things. So it also provides a strong organisational framework for the people or the volunteers who are involved in the centre. So governance is about leadership, so that staff, volunteers know what they need to do and why. There's accountability and transparency in decision making, and people have a framework to work within. And finally, it gives assurance to clients and stakeholders that the service is fulfilling its purpose, providing high quality services, uses its resources wisely and well. So in summary, what we're really talking about is giving stakeholders, the community clients, confidence that your CLC will do the right thing in the management of funds and assets, confidence to protect the interests and meet the expectations of your clients and stakeholders, and that any risks and exposure are properly managed. So one of the things that we all need to keep in mind is that a loss of trust and confidence can have wide potential impacts and repercussions. And so that might be on client services, on your ability to win funding, to retain or attract new members. And it might also affect the CLC or the other organisation's influence. So that's with your local communities, within your service networks of which the centres are part and where it's seen to be a trusted partner. And in providing that voice to power, which is about representations and submissions on behalf of your clients and about the wider service system or the legal system, really that advocacy piece that you want your centre to have the credibility and the opportunity to influence policymakers and decision makers in the broader context. So it only takes one or two mismanagement issues to impact the confidence, and confidence does come from performance over time. So we have included today a little example of things going wrong in the governance space. And we've picked up on Brisbane Youth Services and Bevin, and I understand from Carly that we are planning to run a webinar specifically on this case, but I think it provides a useful example for our purposes here today as well. So I've given you a quick summary of the facts here in case you're not familiar with the matter. So it was essentially that we have a client who was known to have a history of mental health issues, violence and sexualised behaviours, and other workers in that service knew that and refused to see that client. Miss Bevin was a relatively new employee, and she was put into an unsafe situation with that client and was in fact assaulted. And the court found that the risk of assault, including sexual assault, was reasonably foreseeable considering the past history of that client, and there was a significant award of damages made against the service. the failure of the service in this case was to respond reasonably to the relevant risk. So this case provides a pretty clear example of how a failure in your day-to-day systems around work health and safety and systems to ensure that the safety of workers is being properly and effectively assessed has left a service exposed to a significant liability. So there was an award of around 1.5 million, which was affirmed on appeal. So it's not only the work health and safety failure here, it goes to a failure in those systems around effective risk assessment and management, compliance with those systems, and monitoring. So all of those things go to effective governance, and I think it provides a useful window into how something that could be seen as a day-to-day management responsibility has actually ended up having a massive impact on the whole organisation, and how governing body members, whether they're board members, management committee members, really need to be taking an interest in how systems and processes are working effectively within the service. So I just wanted to also touch briefly on the not-for-profit sector, because there are a few characteristics of this sector that are a bit unique in a governance, from a governance perspective. So we have some different organisational structures within the sector. So we've most commonly got incorporated associations, but in Queensland we do have a few public companies limited by guarantee. So they have a slightly different governance structure in place, although it does, we reach the same place with it. I'm not quite sure what the situation is with other jurisdictions. So there's, we've got some variable sizes and operational structures as well. So we have large standalone legal services, we've got small, very small organisations, and we also have services that might be auspiced by a much larger organisation, in which the legal service is just one program of a much bigger multi-program organisation. So that might be under a neighbourhood centre or similar sort of organisation. Regardless of size, all CLCs are governed by volunteer boards or management committees. And I think that's an important point to remember, that the people who are fulfilling these roles are at the end of the day volunteers. A lot of CLCs rely on government funding, but not all of them have that advantage. Some CLCs receive minimal or in fact no government revenue, and so they rely on fundraising, donations or for-profit revenue streams to fund the community legal service, and we have some really interesting things happening in that space with a couple of our centres here. So irrespective of the structure or size, the requirements of good governance still apply. And there's some common legal duties and obligations, and I'll touch on those a bit later on in the webinar. So with that, I guess, bit of scene setting, we'll now take a bit of a closer look at the National Accreditation Scheme for Community Legal Centres. So in Queensland, and I think this is the case in other jurisdictions, although I could be wrong, all CLCs in Queensland have to maintain certification under the NAS. It's a condition of membership of Community Legal Centres Queensland, and membership of CLC Queensland is also a key funding requirement. So the effect of that is that these standards aren't optional. For most CLCs, they're a necessary prerequisite to operating as a CLC in this jurisdiction and in others. And what we need to then understand is that these standards are a core governance requirement for all CLCs. So what does the NAS say about governance? It has a really strong focus on governance. In fact, it's front-loaded for governance. The standards and requirements are made up of 4 sections. They are Section A, which has 2 parts. One is organisational management, the other is information management. There's Section B, which focuses on the provision of legal and related services. Section C is about community development, education and reform activities. And Section D is about access, inclusion and client feedback. So the area of focus today forms part of Section A1, which is organisational management. So there are a few standards to talk about in that context. So Standard A 1.1 relates directly to governance. In fact, it's called governance handily. But there's 4 other standards that also speak to governance issues. Planning, evaluation and quality management, staffing, including volunteers, financial management and risk management and compliance. So I'll speak about that in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. But I thought it was interesting to note that there's a total of 35 sub-requirements across those 5 standards. So each standard is made up of the overall standard and then specific requirements underneath it. And of those 35 requirements of these 5 standards, 28 of those are primary requirements. So it really is a big focus of this scheme. So for those of you who may not be familiar, the primary requirements are those which are seen to be minimum standards. They must be met in order to achieve certification under the scheme. Centres have 12 months from the date of certification to meet their primary requirements and must report back to us on that. And then they have 3 years to meet the other requirements. So there's fairly high standards. So focusing directly on standard A 1.1, then governance, I'm going to focus a little bit of time focusing on this standard because it does contain the main requirements for governance under the NAS. So just as an aside, if you are part of a CLC, you're welcome to review the standards yourself. They're on the members only page of the NACLAC website. They're not generally available, so you do need to be part of a CLC to access them. So I've included for you the key elements of this standard, and I'll go through each of the specific elements in a bit more detail. And I won't go through the specific requirements individually because the conversation about the elements will capture that. But I've just got a little overview on my next slide. But I think from reading that, you can see that these are the essential elements of any framework for good governance. So from that perspective, the NAS isn't reinventing the wheel, but it's really capturing those well-established principles of good governance that I covered earlier in terms of talking about some of the benefits of good governance. So just quickly talking about the specific requirements under each, under the standard. So there's 11 requirements under this particular standard. So 8 of those are primary and 3 are secondary. So the primary requirements go to the definition of the purpose, aims and values. We want a clear definition of the roles and responsibilities of the governing body and its relationship with the CEO and the director. We're looking for documented delegations and lines of authority. We want to see compliance with statutory and contractual obligations and reporting that tells us that that's occurring. We want to see systems for policy and procedures reviews. There needs to be a code of conduct and ethics in place and applied, and that members, management committee members or board members, staff and volunteers all sign. And there needs to be a framework in place for managing conflicts of interest at the centre. Now, I'm not talking about legal practice conflicts of interest. I'm talking about general conflicts of interest that people need to be able to identify when they are in a situation where their personal interest or their professional interest and those of the centre might be in conflict. So the secondary requirements under this standard, which centres have 3 years to meet, relate to systems for appointing people to the governing body, that's documented and those systems are applied in practice, that there's representative membership on the governing body and a good mix of skills. So we're looking to have representation beyond just the legal practice and into really looking at people who reflect the community that the centre is there to serve or particular priority client groups. And then we also are looking for processes around induction and that board members are having the opportunity and in fact taking up regular training and performance, regular training and development, and that the board is reviewing its own performance on a regular basis. So in terms of the elements, these are the high level elements of this standard. So I just wanted to go through these in a little bit of detail because I think they're the heart of what we're talking about today. So define clear goals and the purpose. So it's critical to define that clearly for an organisation, why it exists, what are you here to do, what do you actually then do in practice, who do you do those things for, and how you aim to do those things. So what are your service delivery mechanisms and how are you going to measure success? So how will you know you've achieved it, you've achieved what you've set out to do. So the Constitution is a jumping off point for understanding that organisational purpose, because it will contain the overall statement, organisational statement, plus the objects of the company or the association. What's the vision? The vision's an aspiration, what we want to achieve in the future. So it should be inspirational for everyone involved in the centre, so from members and staff, volunteers, financial supporters and the community. Try and keep it pretty short and to the point, although we understand that's not always possible. So I've got just a few examples that I thought I'd share, and just a shout out to some of our member centres here in relation to these. So the first one is equal access to justice for all members of the community, and that's taken from the Cairns Community Legal Centre. We have young people achieve their full potential through the community, accepting collective responsibility for their importance, empowerment, rights, wellbeing and humanity, and that's from the Youth Advocacy Centre. And then from the Queensland Indigenous Family Violence Legal Service, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities in Queensland are supported to live free from family violence and or sexual assault. So I thought it was useful just to give you a bit of a sense of what a vision actually is, and how some centres have gone about shaping that statement of their intentions. So the next element is to provide leadership, direction and guidance for achieving organisational goals. So this is really about strategy. In a governance context, that refers to the decisions made by the board and management that determine how an organisation will meet its goals while responding to changes in its environment and allocating resources to meet those goals. The process of strategic planning will assist an organisation to answer those key questions. Where is it going? How's it going to get there? How will it know if it's been successful in achieving its aims? This is also, I have to say, about organisational culture. It's about sharing the vision. It's providing the frameworks within which your people can flourish. So the next element that I'd like to touch on is the adequacy of resources for sustainable and effective services. So this is about ensuring that the centre has the money to achieve its objects, purpose and articulated goals. If there's insufficient funding, how can the centre secure other funding or resources to do its work? It might be through fundraising, partnerships or alliances. It might need to seek the assistance of more volunteers, diversify the program base. So these are strategic questions for the board to consider to ensure that your centre is equipped to deliver on its strategic framework and achieve its purpose. Assessing and managing strategic risk. So this is really about understanding the risk environment, the overall context, what the board's risk appetite is, and the treatments and controls that are needed to assess strategic risk. So there's always a balance on a board in dealing with risk between those day-to-day operational risks that the CEO needs to be across, and then the big picture or strategic risk that the board is fundamentally responsible for identifying and managing. And I suppose the Bevin case also tells us that it's really important to keep the links between those particular types of risk in mind, because even though you might see something as a day-to-day risk, actually it's got really important ramifications for the organisation as a whole. So that's really the responsibility of the board to be keeping an eye on those things. So it's also, this standard goes to setting organisational policies, which is really about the board defining the principles and positions which are going to guide actions and decision making in areas of core responsibility. The board should be defining the policies for key governance, strategic, financial, human resource and service delivery matters. The CEO and the managers and staff will develop the procedures that sit under those policies, but it's really for the board or the management committee to agree and approve the overall directions and the documents. So, monitoring achievements and activities. The board has ultimate responsibility for meeting obligations, monitoring performance, achieving key deliverables. Performance and management reporting to the board is one of the main tools, and those reports need to provide enough information so that directors or management committee members can make informed decisions about the overall performance and direction of the centre, to identify systemic issues and big picture trends, and evidence that the objectives and obligations of the centre are being met. So usually you'll see performance reporting is provided by the CEO and other key staff. So that might be the principal solicitor, if that's a separate role from the CEO, the financial manager, or other program leads, if that's relevant to the organisation. And staff should really be available to respond to further questions or requests for more information from the board. In terms of accountability for activities and the activities of the organisation, there are a range of accountability tools that we usually look for. So examples are financial reporting, audits, annual reports, contractual reporting and acquittals, systems for monitoring compliance and regulatory obligations, code of conduct, acting ethically, and the conflicts of interest and managers I've touched on before. So that's a core area that we're always looking for as accreditation coordinators. So that's just a quick run through the actual governance standard. As we said at the outset, I'm more than happy to respond to any questions that you may have in relation to that particular standard or how that applies in practice. Or if your centre hasn't been through a review yet, you may be interested to have a chat to myself or your jurisdictional RAC to get a bit more information about how that applies. So, as I mentioned, there are some other standards that speak to governance under the NAS, and one of those is Standard A1.2, which is Planning, Evaluation and Quality Management. So this standard, in short, requires a planning process in place, and that includes a strategic plan, the monitoring of progress against those plans, regular service evaluation, and outcomes of evaluation and client feedback. So it is a primary requirement of this standard that there's a strategic plan in place that's developed with key stakeholders. So strategies typically characterised by being long-term and uncertain. So a strat plan is really an essential tool for guiding your organisation in meeting its purpose and key outcomes, and to get a clear picture of what's going to constitute success. Setting strategy is the role of the governing body. Implementing on a day-to-day basis is the role of the CEO and management. But it's also an iterative process. So strategy isn't fixed in time. You do your strategic plan, and then it needs to be responsive to the changing context and environmental issues that the centre's facing. For instance, if you do a strategic plan and it's on say a 5-year horizon, and in year 2 you have a massive change to your funding, either positively or negatively, you might find that you need to go back and revisit that strategic plan because some of the goals that you've identified are no longer realistic, or it doesn't actually give full effect to what the centre's now been asked to do. So the other relevant standards under the NAS are standard A1.3 staffing, which requires an organisation to plan, develop and support its workforce to ensure the effectiveness of the organisation and its services. So really what we're seeing here is the board has that responsibility to ensure that workplace culture and systems support a productive and effective workforce. It's also about ensuring that the centre has the resources to do its work, so the human resources to do its work, which will then allow it to achieve its stated goals and objectives and meet its agreed outcomes. So the board should be seeing regular high-level reports on staffing and human resources issues as part of regular performance reporting. And once again, I come back to the Bevin case as a clear example of why the board needs to keep eyes on this issue. Financial management, so the standard requires sound financial decision-making processes and financial management that's transparent, accountable and appropriately authorised. So the effective management of financial resources to ensure best value for money, appropriate allocation of resources and proper financial controls to guard against unauthorised expenditure or fraud are key board responsibilities, clearly. And these can't be delegated away or left to someone more experienced. So every board member has a responsibility to satisfy themselves about the proper use and authorisation of funds in line with the centre's agreed budgets and financial management systems, and that those practices are in accordance with the defined policies and procedures. So that's not something that you can, as a board member, look to someone more experienced in finances to take that responsibility for you. As a board member, you need to make sure that you have the skills and ability to read financial reports and understand financial information to exercise those obligations. So the other standard that we always look at in relation to governance is organisational risk management and compliance, and this standard requires effective processes for identifying and managing risk, which are monitored regularly, including strategic, governance, property, financial, physical, reputational and service delivery risks. So as I discussed under the Standard 8 1.1, identifying, managing and treating strategic risks is a core governance responsibility. You can't delegate that to the CEO. The board's got to have its own discussions and consideration of risk and reviewing that strategic risk environment. So that's about the context and the sort of changes that are happening at the big picture level that might affect a centre. The board's own risk appetite, so how people feel about taking on particular risks. That might be around, implementing a new program or setting up a new outreach service. What sort of risk appetite does the board have, and whether the treatments and controls around those risks are appropriate. I will just say that it's an interesting conundrum with this particular standard that having a risk management plan or a system in place to address risk management is only identified as a secondary requirement. So technically centres have 3 years from the time of certification to address that, to have a framework in place. I think it's fair to say that under the next phase of the accreditation scheme, we'll probably see that tighten up and a risk framework will be identified as a primary requirement, which I think most people who understand governance would say that it clearly is. This standard also captures responsibilities about compliance, and that forms part of your risk management framework, so making sure that the board has information about the meeting of those regulatory, contractual and other legal obligations is a clear responsibility under this standard. So one of the interesting things that we've been able to do from the NAS so far is to pull out a bit of data, and we recognise that it can provide a really useful big picture view of how the sector as a whole is performing and what the areas of particular challenge are for our CLC sector. So we have undertaken some analysis of improvement plans that have been done to date. Now that was against de-identified improvement plans, obviously, so that no particular centre could be identified. And the analysis is really looking for some common trends, showing the main gaps and the areas of challenge, as I mentioned. It's really relevant for today's purposes because it's got some really interesting findings on governance. The data is based on a data set of 59 centres nationally. 22 of those centres were from Queensland. So it's not a massive sample, but it's been a really useful point in time snapshot. So I've just got a few slides here which are showing that data in particular detail. So I won't spend too much time on this. I'm more than happy to have a chat to you offline if you'd like a bit more information. But just quickly, at the national level, we see the data showing that of the 59 improvement plans that were included in the analysis, now this is across all jurisdictions, we're seeing 62% of recommendations relate to Section A, which is governance, management and administration. We've got 21% about access, inclusion and client feedback, so that's Section D of the standards. 13% deal with the provision of legal service, Section B of the standards, and 4% about community development, education and reform. So what that's really telling us is that the organisational management standards, so Section A, is really where we're seeing the biggest gaps for centres overall. And the comparison with Queensland, is, interestingly enough, shows very similar trends and quite similar percentages around that. So of the particular actions within Section A1, which is the organisational management section, we can see a breakdown of the actions nationally. So 39% of recommendations are relating to standard A1.1 governance. It's pretty huge, I have to say. 11% are about A 1.2 planning, 26% are about staffing, 12% are about financial management, and 12% are about risk management and compliance. And once again, we can see that the Queensland percentages quite closely mirror the national picture, except in relation to the financial management recommendations. So Queensland's got about 4% more recommendations than the national figure. So that's an interesting outcome that we're going to be looking at a little bit more closely within CLC Queensland. So we're looking here at a snapshot of the number of CLCs nationally out of the total data set of 59, which were compliant with each standard in Section A. So that's determined by the number of action items. So 0, which you can see there for governance, means no CLCs were fully compliant with the governance standard. So that's a really interesting statistic in and of itself. Not just for those of us who are involved in the administration of the accreditation scheme, but will be of interest, I'm sure, to centres and managers. And that certainly chimes with my experience as a regional accreditation coordinator. I think almost every CLC I have visited so far has had some action to take in relation to the governance standard, even if it's just around skills development for management committee members or those sorts of things. It's not necessarily always about big picture structures, but also about making sure that the board is moving in the right direction. And so once again, I've just given the Queensland breakdown there, and apologies to people from other jurisdictions. I didn't have the data for other jurisdictions, but we can see this very similar slice of data for Queensland. Similar trends showing through. Obviously, the numbers are a lot smaller because the data set was only 22 centres. So I'd like to just speak a little bit about the main governance gaps under the NASDEN that we're seeing, that data shows us, but also anecdotally my experience as the accreditation coordinator, and I've visited about 18 centres in Queensland so far, so it's a pretty good feel for the sorts of gaps that we're seeing. So board recruitment processes are often an area of gap, so that's around the documentation of those processes, including the systems for screening potential appointees. So that's things like reference checks, criminal history checks, ACNC disqualification checks, those sorts of things. And it's not just about doing those in practice, but it's about making sure that's documented and systematised so that there's a common approach taken. I think I have heard from lots of centres that they don't think it's necessary to do screening because people usually come via referral from someone they already know. And I guess my response to that is usually that it's always good to get an external validation of information that you're getting from someone who knows a person. I'm always making recommendations about board membership. So that's about the diversity of members, so where your membership is drawn from. Are there people there who represent particular elements of the local community or priority or target groups for your service, or are they mainly all lawyers? Is there a mix of skills and knowledge? Do you have people who've got some specialist financial management skills? Are there people with knowledge and understanding around governance? If your centre's very active with advocacy, do you have people who understand government and policy? They're the sorts of things that we're interested to see centres bringing on to their management committees. And so we're also seeing some gaps around keeping an eye on the overall skills mix of board members to help guide future recruitment, so that recruitment decisions are taken from the perspective of what skills gaps does the board need rather than just who's available. Another one that I'm regularly making recommendations about is board training and development. So that's about board members updating, refreshing, expanding skills, recognising that we're always learning in this space, that in order to do your job effectively as a management committee member, you need to be on the front foot about keeping your skills refreshed, understanding what your gaps are and addressing those, and deepening your knowledge about the centre and the work that it does. And I think there may only be 1 or 2 centres that I haven't made a recommendation to start for the board to start reviewing its own performance. So I often recommend even a little self-evaluation survey at the end of the year that one of the board members can be the returning officer for and do a little bit of analysis about. But just that insight into, is the board doing what it thinks it needs to be doing? Is it as effective as it can be? And then compliance, I'm often making recommendations about making sure there's a system for providing assurance that you comply with the statutory and contractual obligations, and for making sure that the board itself is informed about those obligations being met. I'm also seeing lots of gaps in definition of board roles and responsibilities, understanding what it is that the board is actually there to do and defining what the expectations are upon board members, and defining the relationship with the CEO. So that's a really critical issue about who is responsible for what, and I will dip into that in more detail in the next section of the webinar. And the delegations of responsibility. So they formally come from the board and they must be signed off and approved by the board, and people taking action can only do so in an authorised way under approved delegations. Policies and procedures, I like to see that there's a system in place for reviewing, monitoring, updating policies and procedures, making sure they remain current and relevant, and identifying when board approval is required. So what kind of changes? Are there some policies that the CEO has delegation to manage? What are the ones that need to come to the board? And then in relation to strategic planning, some centres have a good strategic plan in place but no definition of the planning cycle and the process. So those two things really need to go together so that we understand what the planning cycle is, what the agreed process for this centre is in developing a strategic plan, so that we're taking a systems approach to those responsibilities rather than it just being ad hoc each time. We're seeing pretty limited evaluation of outcomes within centres, but there's a lot of work going on here in CLC Queensland to develop some tools and support for centres around this particular area. We recognise it's becoming a real driver of government policy and funding decisions, that centres are able to demonstrate the difference that they make. So at the moment we're seeing most centres kind of looking at client feedback, and there's limited engagement by boards around this issue, but we're hoping to shift that along in the coming year or so. And then I've touched on risk management earlier, in some centres I'm seeing a lack of strategic engagement about risk. So risk either being delegated fully to the CEO or the board relying on the CEO to bring forward their own assessments of what risk is rather than taking responsibility for looking at and responding to risk themselves, and making sure there's risk management tools in place. So risk management policies and plans so that there's a clear basis on which risk can be identified, managed, treated, and that's tracked over time. So I'm mindful of the time, it's 20 past 11. I'm on to my last section, but we've probably got about 10 slides to go. So I understand that people might need to jump off the webinar. Please feel free to do so. As Carly mentioned, we are making a recording of today, so you'll be able to pick it up later, and I'm always very happy to take questions offline. So governance in practice, I thought it would be useful to run through some of the key structures and tools that we can use to give effect to governance in the real world. So I thought this was a really useful little framework to understand governance responsibilities. So we can see there's the chairperson, the CEO, and the directors. By that I mean the board or management committee directors. And each role has a different set of responsibilities and a different focus. The separation of roles maintains a balance so that there's no personal interest being served or we mitigate against that risk. And all three of those particular functionalities must perform their roles separately, in harmony and in collaboration. So the tension between those roles and responsibilities is one of the critical components in ensuring effective governance. And we look to see how those roles and responsibilities are defined when we're doing our NAS reviews. I often make recommendations to centres, as I've just touched upon. So moving into some specifics then, what we'll do is we'll have a look at the board as a overarching entity, and then we'll break down and have a look at the specific particular elements, so the chair, the CEO and the directors. So for the board itself, it's the governing body, so called because it has ultimate responsibility for overseeing the operations of the centre, ensuring it's working towards meeting its purpose in a way that also meets its ethical, financial and legal obligations. So whatever the structural arrangements are for a CLC, all boards or management committees have the same core roles. So they exist to guide and support the organisation to pursue its purpose. You're concentrating on environmental or big picture, strategic and major decisions, no direct day-to-day operational role, monitoring assurance role and strategic awareness. So the collective decision making, I thought it was just really important to draw out that although the board is made up of a group of individuals, the board only has the power to bind the organisation as a group, not as an individual member. So that means that only group decision making has effect. So every meeting has to have a quorum to make effective decisions, which is the minimum number of members that can make binding decisions. And it's really a team effort. You're not going to be able to do it on your own as a board member. You have to work effectively with your colleagues. The relationship with the CEO or the senior manager, whatever the title of that person is, it's the crucial one for good governance, really. So the challenge is not to dip into the day-to-day management of the centre, which is the responsibility of the CEO. So there's a range of responsibilities that are delegated, and they really need to form, the CEO really needs to take responsibility for those matters, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Noting that there's some duties and responsibilities that can't be delegated away, and I'll touch on those a little bit further on. So here is really a summary of the board's formal roles and responsibilities. So you can see the links between governance under the NAS standards and the degree to which all of the core governance responsibilities fall within the role of the board. I'll go into more detail about the role of the chair in my next slide, but I will just mention the specific office bearer responsibilities of the secretary and the treasurer in an incorporated association. I note that for companies limited by guarantee, there's directors and a company secretary, so we're not necessarily talking about a treasurer per se. But in an incorporated association, we're looking at the treasurer, who has the role to lead and monitor financial performance, financial processes and ensure financial reporting obligations are maintained. And then the secretary ensures that the business of the governing body meetings are prepared and recorded, responsible also for things like organisational records, the constitution, the register of members, those types of things. So in terms of the chair, they need to have a clear understanding of the environmental and strategic approach of the organisation. They oversee meeting processes, they chair board meetings, and they may also represent the organisation externally. They use stewardship to focus the board. What we're really talking about there is that they're responsible for setting the tone and the culture of the board or the management committee, for guiding decision making, ensuring the board and the organisation's on the right track. It's a key role. It provides overall leadership for the board, but it's also a guide and a sounding board for the CEO, and it's the conduit between the board itself and the CEO. And usually the chair will meet with the CEO on a regular basis or as required. The chair usually also leads the recruitment and induction of new board members and the recruitment of the CEO, as well as that day-to-day management task. So in terms of the CEO, his or herself, I'm not quite sure I've got the right formulation of words there, but so the CEO is responsible for operational matters. So that's operational management and leadership of the whole organisation. The CEO's job is really about the how and the who. The board needs to be providing direction to the CEO around the what and the where. So that links back to my discussion of those things earlier in the session. So the CEO focuses on the long term. So a good CEO is keeping their eye on the big picture and the long term to meet the challenges of today, as well as what's coming up ahead, and really implementing the board's agreed directions and making sure that's done in a sustainable way. They're providing information to the board and reporting to inform the board's deliberations and decision making. So effective governance, as I've touched on before, is really based on that working relationship between the board and the CEO, and it should be founded on mutual respect. I would say that if that relationship breaks down or doesn't work properly, you can actually, in the worst case, get complete organisational paralysis, which no one wants to get to. I would just note also that part of the tension within that relationship is that the board relies on the CEO for information and advice, but it's also responsible for managing the CEO's performance. And there is a risk that the board can become sort of captured by the CEO, which means that they're too willing to be led on direction and major decisions and not prepared to challenge or seek alternative inputs or information. So regular performance reviews by the board of the CEO, clear expectation and direction from the board are really crucial to the effectiveness of that relationship. The CEO also has to be across the financial detail, be able to inform the board decision making and help to understand the financial implications of key initiatives. The key responsibility of the board is the selection and appointment of the CEO director, and there will be an instrument of delegation which is clear about what things the CEO is delegated to take responsibility for. So the final tranche of that three-way governance relationship is really the board or management committee directors. So they're the means by which the board functions and fulfills its responsibilities. So individual members have to focus on and be satisfied about the effectiveness of strategic decision making by the board. They have no day-to-day operational role, but they do have a responsibility to monitor major operational decisions or issues. So examples of that might be, for instance, setting up and rolling out a new program function, or setting up a new branch, or delivering on the contractual obligations of the centre. They need to consider the risk impact of board decisions. So as I've touched on already, consideration of risk is a core part of responsibilities as a director. So, and if it isn't a filter through which every decision passes to every director, then I'd have to say I think they're probably not doing their job properly. But it's not up to directors to micromanage the day-to-day risk that a centre confronts or deals with. That's for the CEO, but that strategic risk environment awareness of the big picture is really the crux of it. So the board directors also have to perform oversight and control functions. So examples of that will be overall performance monitoring, ensuring regulatory accountabilities are appropriately met, that there's systems and processes in place to address risk and strategy, and that the CEO performance reviews are occurring. So I just wanted to touch on the actual legal duties and liabilities of directors, because I suppose in my experience as an accreditation coordinator, I do get concerned that this is an area that board and management committee members perhaps just that they need to keep in sharp focus at all times. So they go to the heart of the responsibilities as a director, and they should be held in mind by everyone who's a board or management committee member, or if you're planning to join a board or management committee. So these legal duties and liabilities derive from the fiduciary nature of the relationship between a committee member and an organisation's members. Sometimes these are also included in associations and corporation acts. So the board's responsible for ensuring the centre complies with its legal obligations. So they're around the Constitution, incorporation, employment, tax, privacy laws, contractual obligations. So that's irrespective of the size or structure of the not-for-profit. So what are those actual responsibilities? Directors have personal legal responsibility to act in good faith and for proper purpose. So that means to act honestly, fairly and loyally when making decisions for the organisation, to act with care, diligence and skill. So that's take the role seriously, utilise their skills for the benefit of the organisation, and give time and consideration to the decisions that need to be made. You need to be monitoring the affairs, activities, strategic direction and financial position of the organisation. Not to misuse information or position. So a current or former member must not make improper use of their position on the governing body or information obtained through that position to gain advantage for them or another person or organisation, or to cause detriment to the organisation itself. and to disclose and manage conflicts of interest. So when the duty to act in the best interest of the organisation conflicts with the opportunity or potential to personally benefit. So I've just got a little note there about you can get some more information off the Justice Connect website, which has got a really good analysis of duties and liabilities. So I did also just want to mention a couple of other things that are relevant here. So the ACNC's governance standard number 5 applies to registered charities. So just refer to their website for more information about that. And directors of companies limited by guarantee also have requirements under the Corporations Act. So both of those things are relevant. So we're nearly finished. I just wanted to have a quick run through what some of the tools for good governance might or are. So these are really the things that allow governance to occur in practice, so how it's put into effect. So they provide the framework that can be used to support effective governance in the CLC or, in fact, any not-for-profit organisation. So I'll run through these reasonably quickly. I'm mindful of the time. So the Constitution and the rules, so that's the guiding document for the centre, and it will provide the framework within which governance at the centre occurs. Underpinning the Constitution will be the agreed policies and procedures for how governance will work in practice. So systems to keep those policies and procedures updated and relevant are really essential to make sure that the centre can meet its purpose and is fulfilling its obligations. Board meetings, so the Constitution will specify the minimum number of meetings that need to be held each year and what constitutes a quorum. I note, though, in practice that for many centres there's often lots more meetings than are technically required, and that not least because that's the only way all of the essential information and functions can be met across the year. And I think it's true to say that as obligations upon centres and regulatory requirements have increased, the complexity of our service delivery environments increased, really the days of a board only meeting 4 times a year are probably over. Performance and financial reporting. So this is the reporting that will go to the board, and it needs to provide enough information to let the board make informed decisions about the overall performance and direction of the centre. So it's usually provided by the CEO and other key staff, so I've touched on earlier, so that might be the principal solicitor, the financial manager, other program leads, and staff should be available to respond to questions against their reports. Definition of roles and responsibilities, I've talked about that and a few different times through the webinar. It's really about making sure everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing and what they're responsible for. So that separation of roles is a crucial element of proper governance, and it does create that constructive tension. So while the CEO shouldn't be micromanaged, nor should the board just be passively led. So the board really does need to be active. So then other things that are really useful tools or essential tools for good governance, so the strategic plan and risk reviews. This shouldn't just be dipped into once a year at the annual planning day. Strategic environment needs to be a standing agenda item. Consideration of risk needs to occur on an ongoing basis as well as through a formal risk review process. Succession planning is relevant to both turnover on the board itself and also for CEO replacement, so at the end of the contract or resignation, etc. And board skills and training, this relates to succession planning. So it's about the need to ensure the board has the skills to govern the centre. So you really want to be making sure that the board is getting some training, not just on its particular professional skills, but maybe also the programs or clients that your centre works with. Who on the board has got the insight or the expertise into the broader social or personal challenges that your clients grapple with, mental health issues, violence, substance abuse? How would that inform your thinking as a director? Monitoring compliance and accountabilities. So you need some tools to make sure that the board can assure itself of the centre's compliance and accountability. So I recommend to centres that they look at a compliance register and that's tabled at least a couple of times a year so the board can have confidence that those key requirements are being met. Relationships and culture. So good governance really does depend on the quality of the relationships, respect, confidence, commitment. So that's relationships with each other board member, with the CEO, with stakeholders, staff and volunteers. And I encourage boards to be determined to create a culture where everyone can express their views and will be listened to. that change and improvements are welcomed and people know they're valued. And then board self-evaluation is really a chance to have a look at how the board can be more effective and actively encourage self-reflection. So they're just a quick run through of some of the sort of key tools that will bring governance to life within your centre. So that was really what I wanted to cover with you today. I'm sorry that I've had to go fairly quickly, but we did have a lot of ground to cover. I have given a bit of information there about some additional information and resources that you might want to access. These have certainly been the core resources that I've had reference to in pulling this webinar together today. So that's all I wanted to say. I'm happy to open up to any questions that we could answer. We might have perhaps a few minutes for questions and then encourage people to put them in writing to me and I can respond to them later.
Thanks so much, Penny. That was really good. I mean, there's obviously so much that can be spoken about when it comes to governance, and probably each of those subtopics could be its own webinar. But hopefully Penny gave you a really good overview of some of the main features of governance for your organisations. So we'll just turn to the questions now, and there have been a lot coming through, so thank you so much for sending those in. We're just going to filter through these and hopefully be able to respond to those questions for you. Okay. All right. So this one here is a little bit of a comment. So maybe Penny, you could just sort of talk to this. I'll read it out. So this person has seen the aftermath of a breakdown in the relationship between various members of the board and CEO. So complete fracture between principal lawyer and two factions of the board. The board factions were divided across lawyer and community member lines. So the question is really, do you have any thoughts around how to create a constructive tension between the board and CEO and within the board itself, hopefully not leading to a complete fracture that was seen here?
Yeah. Look, it's a really good question. Thank you very much. I think it does go to the heart of the challenge of a governance structure that relies on sort of three key components to be working effectively. I think there's a few things that we need to be mindful of. The recruitment of board members is a really critical responsibility, and this is why I always say to people it's very important to make sure that you're getting people on the board who have a clear commitment to the purpose and objects of the organisation, that have the right skills and knowledge, but also fit with the board group that's there and can work as part of a team. I always say to people, you don't really know. Things are okay until they're not. Everything's fine until it's not, and it's not until things start to go wrong that you can kind of see where the failure in systems and processes might be. So the board recruitment is really critical. I think it's really important that people have a very clear understanding of what their particular roles and responsibilities are, and a commitment to treating each other with respect and living the values of the organisation. So I think those things are the fundamental drivers of being able to create a constructive tension rather than a destructive tension. And I think any of us who've been involved with governance for a while have been through situations where things have gone wrong, and things do go wrong, and we need to be able to work our way through that in a constructive way, and that's where the policies and procedures of the organisation are really critical, and people need to be on the front foot about getting those systems in place before things go wrong, because it's too late once the relationships have started to fracture to try and go back and fix it. So I'm not sure whether that answers the question, but I suppose it's the best advice I could give at this point.
Thanks, Penny. I will just remind everyone, I forgot to do this at the start, how to ask questions, just for those who might have missed that at the beginning of the presentation. So you can actually type your questions into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel, or you can pop your hand up and we'll see the hand go up at our end if you want to ask your question verbally. Obviously, you'll need a microphone to do that. So on to the next question here, and this one is this is quite a tricky constitutional law sort of question here. So what constitutes preventing insolvent trading when you're dependent on government funding that is at the whim of the governing party? So a little example around EDO's funding both at state and federal levels, where contracts have been broken and funding cancelled due to a change in government. So it's a bit of a tricky one.
Yeah, it is a tricky question, and probably a bit too technical for me to cover in a lot of detail here, but I suppose a few things occur to me in relation to it. One, I guess the first one is that it's important for centres to have a reasonable level of reserve or buffer to be able to bridge themselves across difficulties in relation to funding or resourcing. I certainly understand that the insecurity of funding that can come through a single funding source, say of government funding, does create its own particular sets of risks for an organisation, and they are things that a board must keep front and centre in its mind. The responsibilities to avoid insolvent trading don't go away just because you've got a single line of funding. Those responsibilities remain on foot. And if it's the case that funding is withdrawn or broken up, and that means that the centre is no longer able to meet its bills as and when they fall due, then that is a matter for immediate and serious consideration by a management committee, and that may even involve the centre having to be merged or wound up. In the worst case scenario, I happen to know that EDO's managed to diversify its funding base really effectively and has ameliorated those risks. But it's definitely something that, there's a particular risk that comes from having a single source of funding, and I think that one's a key one, but it doesn't remove the responsibilities upon directors in relation to those legal obligations to avoid insolvent trading.
Thanks, Penny. So the last question that's come through, and before we wrap up for today, unless anyone's got any questions they want to type in now, so that we can get to them in the live webinar. So Penny, what's your view on centre volunteers acting both as legal volunteers and directors of the organisation? So a dual role.
Wow, that's quite a tricky one.
Very busy person.
Yeah, very tricky one. Look, I might actually have to take that question on notice, I think, and perhaps have a chat to some of my colleagues here and seek some further advice. I suppose my initial response is that I think it's always a bit dangerous when you have people who have responsibility for the governance of the organisation also then involved in the delivery of services. But I also understand that particularly in small communities perhaps, or where it's difficult to find volunteers, that sometimes people do have to wear multiple hats. In that situation, the walls and the systems in place to prevent the conflicts of interest that are inherent in wearing dual roles must be really strong, and that particular person must have a clear eye to being able to remove themselves from any decisions that may impact on their performance of responsibilities as a legal volunteer. But I was certainly happy to take that on notice and come back with a more formalised response to that question.
That's great. I think that is everything today. So all the questions that have come through. Any further questions, you might want to send those over to me or to Penny directly. Just a reminder that there are some really good resources that Community Legal Centre Queensland has been working on. So the strategic planning toolkit that we've developed is on our website if you want to take a look. Just some practical tools on how to go about the actual strategic planning process. Penny also mentioned the self-evaluation toolkit that is coming soon and will be launched at our conference. And also at our conference, we'll have a specialist governance consultant presenting a session. So if you haven't already bought a ticket, it might be worthwhile coming along for those two sessions at the least. CLC managers and board members that are attending today, please feel free, once the recording is sent out to you, to forward that to your fellow board members. I think it's really, really worthwhile to sort of get some of that training happening within the board, as Penny mentioned. And this would be a really good starting point, particularly for new members or perhaps people who maybe haven't refreshed their brains on this topic for some time. Thank you so much, Penny. That was really informative and so much information to digest. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. I'll be popping the recording up online and emailing it out to you sometime this afternoon. Thanks so much, everyone. See you later.
Thanks, Carly. See you.